My aim here today is to talk to you and give you an understanding about the origins and the theory behind sustainability, so that you can understand how that interacts with the Vivacity 2020 project that I'm going to talk about, and also how it affects cost management in the construction process. My name's Dan Cadman, and I'm quite fortunate because I have sort of two hats that I wear. One is as a senior project surveyor at David Langdon, and I'm involved in mainly commercial offices, get a lot involved in sort of sustainable technologies, that sort of thing. And also we use BREEAM quite a lot because we do a lot of commercial offices for main top 10 UK clients. But I'm also, as Tim mentioned, a PhD student at Lancaster University and a postgraduate researcher on Vivacity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, this is what I'm going to talk to you today about in my presentation. I'm going to talk about the Vivacity 2020 project. I'm then going to talk about, the bulk of the presentation is on the history and the sort of origins behind sustainability and where it came from sort of in the earliest times, the earliest sort of things we came across in terms of sustainability. And then I'm going to just briefly mention cost management at David Langdon and what we do in terms of sustainability. So, Vivacity 2020. This was a £3 million EPSRC funded research project that's been going on over the last 5 years. It's basically to go out and look at what's happening in design and construction, talk to people in the industry, talk to residents, people who use urban environments, to try and understand how we use urban environments, and to sort of map the processes therein so we can understand where sustainability is in that and where it should be if it's not involved in it. And we also, the sort of outcomes of Vivacity was to design tools and best practice and guidance for people to take our knowledge forward and to disseminate it throughout not just academia but also throughout industry. So how do we do that? Well, Vivacity involved 5 UK universities. I'm based at Lancaster with a colleague of mine, Chris Boyko, who's looking at the urban design decision-making process. But also there was a lot of work done in University of Salford about design against crime. University College London and London Met did a lot of work in the Clerkenwell area of London, talking to local residents, and there's also work done at the University of Sheffield. Now, we did 3 case studies on Vivacity over the first 3 years of the project. The last 2 we used for analysis. But we concentrated on 3 cities: the city centre in Manchester, the Devonshire quarter in Sheffield, and also the Clerkenwell and Brent areas of London. And we used a variety of different methods, going out and talking to people both in industry and also local residents. We also took a lot of quantitative data, sort of noise data in areas, pollution data, that sort of thing. So we've got a variety of data about these areas. And what we did is Vivacity was split into 8 work packages. Now, I was involved in work package 1, which was going out into industry and talking to people about how the design process works and what happens in the design process. And we went and looked at the literature, things like the RIBA plan of work, so the Squeeze construction process protocol over at Salford a couple of years back. Looked at all the different sort of systems of design and planning and how they work. And then we went and talked to people in the industry, and what we did was developed a sort of as-is process of how the design process has worked in the past. And the idea behind that was to, if we can understand how the process is working, then we can see where sustainability is within that process and how we can embed sustainability throughout the process. And it was an idea to develop this as-is process. We then held an expert panel to sort of validate that, and so we went back to the construction industry leading figures and said to them, is this representative of the design process? And that was quite successful, so we moved on from that and developed a 2B process, a sustainable process. The other work packages up there were different universities, involved a number of people from across academia. The main one, I think, that I was involved with as well was the design against crime at Salford, and Andy Wootton was involved in that. And they did a lot of work going out into city centres, talking to the police and talking about how people move through areas and how that affects crime. Also, a very interesting work package was one done down in UCL, was the work package 7, was looking at public toilets in cities and how that affects crime, how that affects other issues, or how the lack of public toilets in cities may also affect on those. And there was some quite interesting papers came out of that project. And finally, University of Salford, work package 8, looked at ICT support solutions to disseminate all that knowledge, basically build up a database and a legacy archive of all the knowledge that we have. And the idea is to put that out there so that people can interrogate. They can go to a certain street in a certain city and say, right, what's the pollution on that site? What's the noise like there? What do local residents think of it? And basically use all that data to provide better informed decisions for people who are making planning decisions in the future in those areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Work Package 1. One of the things to come out of Work Package 1 is we didn't like the idea of a linear design process. We felt it was more circular. So what Chris did was develop this sort of idea of a loop, where you've got the pre-design, just the idea about what you want to do in an area, and you've got the orange section, which is what Work Package 1 concentrated on, which is the design and the development process through construction at the end of that. And you've got the use, management and maintenance of a building or an area over the life cycle of that asset. And then you've got decline and demolition at the end, and that loops back into regeneration. But the thing was, you might have, that could be representative of an area or a building. Now, if it's representative of a building, there could be different buildings in the same area that are at different points within that timescale. So the second diagram on the right there shows a number of buildings or areas that are in different points of its life cycle. So if we take that to the sort of next step, we've got an area, say the City of Manchester. It's got a whole number of strategies, a whole number of developments, all at different points in the life cycle. And what drives that round is the strategy underpinning that. If there's a master planning strategy, there's a strategy from the local authority that's just driving that process forward. And you've got things like external influences, such as climate change or disasters. Like a good example is the flooding in Prague in 2002, which had really widespread impacts on how they planned and designed the city after that, and a lot of all the sort of flood barrier measures that they put in, and that had effects on how they designed the buildings that they put in as well. But you've also got things like government policy, which has an influence on that whole sort of circle of circles. So, moving on to the next part of the topic, which is about sustainability. And what I want to talk about really is just to understand sustainability a little bit more, so you can see how that fits into the as-is process and how we can create a to-be process. Now, the earliest evidence about sustainability that I found in my research is in India. The first Buddhist king of India, around 300 BC, recognised that it was possible to exploit resources beyond sustainable means. So he issued a number of laws, known as the Rock and Pillar Edicts, to prevent that exploitation of natural resources. So that was a long, over 2,000 years ago, somebody recognising that we can exploit resources beyond what the earth can sustain. Obviously, it didn't mention sustainability back then, but there's a sort of idea behind that. Now, the modern movement, I think, a lot of people would agree that sustainability is sort of founded in the environmental and the ecological movements that began in the sort of late 50s, early 60s. And one of the first sort of real pieces of literature to come out back then was Rachel Carson's work, Silent Spring, which was based on the chemical and herbicide industry in the United States. And I'll come back to that in a moment and talk a little bit more about that. But I think, so this is a select few pieces of literature that I found quite influential in my work. The next one is James Lovelock and his Gaia theory. Now, this was a hugely controversial theory at the time this was produced. Lovelock sort of postulated that actually the Earth and the systems within the Earth was just one big system. So you've got the atmosphere, the biosphere, the oceans, the soil, and life itself on Earth actually helps to regulate a self-sustaining system. And it was all interlinked. And this was hugely controversial at the time, and many scientists disagreed with it. And the actual argument against Gaia sort of got scientists thinking about how the Earth works and how the systems of the Earth work. And it's actually, today I think it's fairly common that people take the idea of this self-regulated system as almost taken for granted, because you've got the effect of emissions on climate change and how that affects temperature. Because the example Lovelock gave was that, as Neil showed in his talk, that the temperature of the Earth over the last few thousand years, few million years, has been relatively constant. there's been a range of temperatures, there's been ice ages, but overall, the global temperature on the Earth has stayed relatively constant. And it's also optimum for life on Earth as well, the relative temperature. But in that time, and from the time since the Earth started to today, the Sun has got 25% hotter, approximately 25% hotter, and it will continue to get hotter until it finally burns itself out in a few billion, trillion years. But how has the temperature on Earth stayed the same if the actual source that's heating the Earth has become 25% hotter? There must be something regulating the Earth's systems to maintain that stable temperature. And that was what Lovelock postulated, that it was all the interaction of light in the atmosphere. So moving on to Lovejoy, he was a conservationist, and he postulated the idea that actually ecosystems are all interlinked, and if you take species extinction, for example, the underlying species extinction rate, the background rate over the last 2,000 years, probably up until about 1600, was approximately 10 species a year were going extinct. From 1600, that began to increase, and then from 1800 and the Industrial Revolution, it sort of exponentially increased. The current rate today, based on the IUCN Red List, is approximately 1,000 species per year are going extinct, and that's mainly due to human actions on the environment. The thing about ecosystem decay is, when those species go extinct, if you reach a tipping point, and if a number of species goes extinct, then the ecosystem cannot sustain itself, and therefore it just collapses. And you've got related ecosystems, and if you take it to the nth degree, if we reach a point where so many species and so many plants and animals have gone extinct that it can no longer sustain a self-regulating system, then you get global ecosystem decay, and that's basically the end of everything, which is a little bit gloomy. But, that's where we're heading if we don't think about what we're doing and make the changes now. Then you've got the famous sort of the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Report. Everybody's familiar, or I assume everybody's familiar with their definition. I'll come back and talk a little bit about that later. Then we've got the idea of ecological footprints and what our own consumption of resources is affecting the planet and what we use. And in terms of the UK, we had DEFRA and the ODPM sort of setting out their strategy to deliver sustainable development. And then Lovelock, again, a couple of years ago, sort of brought his research up to date, and also, controversially again, one of the things to come out of that book was his championing of the nuclear power industry, and saying that actually, although the nuclear waste is not very nice, in order to produce the energy that we require and to reduce carbon, we need to build more nuclear power stations. Just like to go back to Carson for a moment. There's a quote that Carson was right at the front of her book, which I find very interesting, because I think it gives both a concise summation of the problem, but also a sort of potential way forward for the solution. And she quoted White, and I'm just going to read it out because I quite like this. White said that, "I am pessimistic about the human race because it is too ingenious for its own good. Our approach to nature is to beat it into submission, and we would stand a better chance of survival if we accommodated ourselves to this planet and viewed it appreciatively instead of sceptically and dictatorially." So he sort of said there that there's a tendency to view the Earth as something to be used, something to be consumed, and if we actually work with the Earth, then maybe we can make a real change. And Carson's work, actually, the catastrophic events of things like DDT in the 60s, it really did get people thinking about the environment a lot more. Now, sustainability. I've put this slide in because I think a lot of people talk about different things when we talk about sustainability. There are just 3 different names for the topic. Another one, the one I prefer, is just not up there, is developing sustainability, talking about actually developing the concept of sustainability. I think the problem with sustainable development is there's a lot of talk about what sustainability is, and not a lot of action about actually getting on and doing it. And I think there's a danger that we concentrate too much on naming the topic rather than actually getting on with what we need to do. Most common definition, Brundtland, meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. 2 things in that: poverty is given priority, and also technology. There's been a lot of criticism of Brundtland over the years, meaning of future generations is too vague. Who are future generations? Is it our children? Is it our children's children? Or is it people 100 years from now, people 1,000 years from now? When does sustainability finish? Does it ever finish? There's also the definition is inconsistent and its solutions are too ambiguous. There's a lot of criticism of Brundtland at the time because that report was written to cater not only to the environmentalists, but also to big business, and it was to get big business on board. So it was sort of very watered down, it was very weak. And also the last point there, that sustainable development, is it just a new name to continue same practices, same focus on economic growth under the sort of principle of it being green, it being sustainable? There are a lot of questions from that. Now I think sustainability is about all these things up here, a number of different interlinked variables, and the importance is to take a holistic view of all these variables and not just treat them in isolation. I'm going to look at each one of these in detail. The first item, and the economic, environmental and social variables of sustainability are talked about quite often. But, and this was talked about a little bit about yesterday, weak and strong sustainability. In terms of weak sustainability, it's a sort of human view of sustainability is adopted. It's about increasing production, not having to worry about consumption because we'll just make more. And there's also a thought about the perpetuation that nature is a resource to be utilised as we decide. And that's got its roots in sort of Judeo-Christian beliefs of human dominance over the earth and humanity's right to use resources as we see fit. Conversely, strong sustainability talks about limiting production to that within carrying capacity, which I'll come back to in a minute. But also that new technology shouldn't be about increasing production, it should be about increasing the efficiency of what we're currently doing. And also, we shouldn't use renewable resources faster than they can regenerate. And also, non-renewable resources shouldn't be used unless we can replace them with renewable resources. And also, really strong advocates of strong sustainability would say that we shouldn't use non-renewable resources at all because we should be passing on the same resources that we have today to future generations. Economic sustainability is defined as a real increase in GNP per capita over time. It doesn't result in biophysical or social impacts, which may threaten that growth. Is continuous economic growth sustainable? The word sustain itself means just making changes to maintain the sort of status quo over time. Sustainability is sort of contradictory in itself as well because nothing can be sustained indefinitely. You can't sustain human life, for example, indefinitely. It always has an end. When it comes to social sustainability, it's about continually improving standards of living, continually improving health and education of nations. Can that be done without continually consuming more and more? So we've got to think about that, and we've also got to think about how that interacts not just with humanity, but with all the species on the Earth as well. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this sort of idea of economic, social, and environmental sustainability. The idea is that they're not separate and equal things. You can't treat them in isolation. You've got to look at them as a sort of interlinked, interdependent phenomenon. And a lot of people would say sustainability is the point in the middle there, where they all overlap, and that's sustainability. I actually would take this diagram a little bit further and think that they're not just interdependent, they're also hierarchical. As the next slide shows, you can't have a society unless you've got an environment. Because without an environment, nothing can survive. So you've got to have an environment to have a society. You can't have an economy without a society because you have to have society's rules in order for an economy to function. So they're all interdependent and hierarchical against each other. Now, the arrows in these two diagrams represent use of resources. The one on the left represents an economy that's using more resources than society can withstand, and that leads to things like social breakdown, social decline of areas. And then you've also got both the economy and society using more resources than the environment can provide over a long period of time. The ideal is to get to the diagram on the right, which shows an economy functioning within the realms of its society and the resources within its society, and then society and the economy functioning within the limits recognised by the environment. So the next sort of three variables that we talk about in terms of sustainability, but the political, legal and technological ones. Technology is quite simple. It's about developing technology to help us meet these needs by improving efficiency, improving, I suppose, reducing carbon emissions and things like PV and wind and renewable technologies, making them more efficient and making them take over from non-renewable technology that we've got at the moment. Legislation is, I think it's an idea whether you use a stick or the carrot approach. Do you incentivise people to make changes? Such as at David Langdon at the moment, there's an incentive in the company that if you have a company car, for example, that is greener and produces less carbon, you get a larger allowance, and therefore you've got a financial incentive to get a greener car. The government are doing the same thing, but when that incentivisation doesn't work, you need to legislate to move people towards where you want them to be. And politically is a big one, because we need a culture change within society, and certainly within Western society, that's currently politically unacceptable. You couldn't tell people tomorrow to stop using airplanes and travel internationally, because the government would get voted out and somebody else would come in and that would change. It's just not acceptable. So there are a lot of political questions to be answered about how we move from where we are today to becoming sustainable in the future. Some more variables. Bruntman talked about poverty. Poverty is a big one. With the global economy, it's prospered in recent years, but the rich have grown richer, the poor have grown poorer, and that's only going to get worse as resources become more scarce. And it's all related. Intergenerational equity is about poverty. It's about having equity between all people on the earth within the current generation, not even thinking about future generations, but ensuring that all people in all countries have the same access to wealth and resources. And this ties in with ecological justice, which is about, there are three types of justice. There's intergenerational equity, making sure that everybody in the current generation has equity. And then there's equity to future generations to make sure they have the same access to resources. There's also one that I think is often overlooked and never really thought about, and that's justice to nature. What about the other species on the earth? We're consistently focusing on humanity, but what about the rights of nature and other species? And also, this ties in with ecological footprint, because we were talking yesterday about the UK utilising 3 planets worth of resources and materials, the US up to 5 planets worth. Well, if we get to a sustainable position, say everybody on Earth uses only 1 planet's worth of resources, what about the resources required by the rest of the people on the Earth, the rest of the species on the Earth? The resources they need and they use. If humanity is using 1 planet, there's nothing left for the rest of the system to function. So we've actually got to use less than 1 planet's worth of resources. But also that ties in with population as well, because population is a big threat to sustainability. The current global population is 6 billion. Now, if we use 1 planet's worth of resources to sustain 6 billion people, which we currently don't, and we're nowhere near, what happens in 100 years' time when the population of the Earth is predicted to go to 9 billion? You know, we can't produce enough food to feed the 6 billion people on the Earth today. How are we going to feed 9 billion people? Especially when a lot of the agricultural land that we need to grow that food is going to be used for things like biofuels, biomass boilers. So that's another question. Some of these sustainable technologies, we've got to be careful that they are sustainable and they're not just quick fixes. And I talked earlier about the loss of species and the effect or the unknown effects that losing so many species has. And we have to think about these things when we're considering sustainability. I mean, one of the things about ecosystems is cities and human developments break up ecosystems, because in the past, before humans were so predominant on the Earth, there was a lot of movement between species, a lot of movement. And how do we ensure that we can still get that movement of wildlife when it's got to go through cities, it's got to go through roads and infrastructure and all the rest of it? And how do we ensure that these ecosystems can survive? Finally, the last 2 things, carrying capacity. I think this is one I've not actually heard it mentioned over the last couple of days in the presentations. Carrying capacity is central to sustainability. Carrying capacity is about how many people can exist in a sustainable manner on a projected set of resources. We know what the resources are. We have a very good idea of what resources we have. We know how many people we've got. How do we ensure that those 2 can be mixed together and be sustainable? So carrying capacity is a critical point in sustainability. And finally, ecological footprint. I'm not going to dwell too much on ecological footprint, because there's been a couple of presentations over the last couple of days which have talked about it. But one thing I would say about ecological footprint is, if we talk about it in terms of economics, If you take an average graduate salary in London, say at 24,000 a year, and you've got that for your year, and that's your set of resources. Now, if your lifestyle means that you're spending £8,000 a quarter, at the end of quarter 3, you've got no resources left, you're bankrupt. It's not a place you want to be. So how does that affect in terms of ecology? And this is some research that was based on the ecological footprint of Waganackle and Rees, and it was done by the Global Footprint Network last year. And this shows how, if we have a projected set of resources, one planet for 1 year, in 1987, the day we ran out of resources was here in December. And in 2006, it was October the 9th. So every year, in the last 20 years, we've lost a month in terms of we're bankrupt a month earlier. And a bankrupt planet Earth means no survival, there's nothing left. So we've got to be conscious that we are living beyond our means, and we've got to move away from consuming so much and using so much. And I'd just like to finish a little bit. I've talked a lot about sustainability and some of the issues with sustainability, and I thought I should put in how Davis Langdon and what we're doing at Davis Langdon affects sustainability and how we can affect sustainability on individual projects. Essentially, Davis Langdon, for those of you who don't know what we do, we're an international project and cost management consultancy. We do a lot of other stuff, such as tax and specification, but our core business is project management, project cost management. Historically, we're a firm of quantity surveyors, and we manage cost on projects. So we do have limited input into what can be done in terms of sustainability in a project. But where we do have input is we can advise and support design teams, and we can give them cost options and tell them, you know, if you do this, it's going to cost more in terms of capital expenditure, but you're going to save it in revenue expenditure over a number of years. So we can show that. We can do things like whole life costing to show clients that, yes, it is going to cost you more, but you are going to save money in the future. And we also have things such as like KPIs that we can introduce on projects, and we have our own sustainability consultancy that's headed up by a guy called John Connaughton down in London. And they look at projects and see how they can improve the sustainability through the use of targets and performance indicators in order to ensure that sustainability doesn't become a bolt-on, it doesn't become a wind turbine 6 months into the project because all it needs to be sustainable. It doesn't become PV or something that's just added in. It needs to be embedded throughout the process, and we need to ensure that if it is embedded throughout the process, that it can't be just knocked off because of cost reasons at the end. It's very easy if you've got wind turbines on a project that's $500,000 over budget. That's the first thing you look at to get rid of. But if it's things that are embedded throughout the process, if it's the actual design of the building, things like natural daylight, high thermal mass, you can't strip them out as easily without having effects on both cost and value in the building. There's a big list of things that Davis Langdon do there. I'm not going to move through each one of them. But if anybody would like more information about what Davis Langdon does in terms of sustainability, then please come and see our stand, because we've got a lot of sort of leaflets and advice about what services we offer. So, in terms of my speech today, I've sort of given you a brief overview of the Vivacity process and the Vivacity research project, and please do look out for the book that comes out at the end of the year, which is going to disseminate all the information, all the people. We must have spoken to over 500 people in terms of interviews, both from industry and local residents in areas, and that's all going to be subsumed within the book, and which will release later in the year. I then talked a lot about sustainability from its origins and its theory, and some of the things that are within sustainability that don't often get thought about in terms of the construction process. And then finally, just a brief review there of what Davis Langdon's role in sustainability. So thank you very much.